Hello, this is Mr. Davis, and these are the Style Pile Notes. These notes are a series of lessons that are designed to help writers add sentence variety and style to their writing so that we can go beyond simple sentences such as, my dog ran, to more complicated and stylish structures like, my dog, the beautiful, courageous pug, ran hideously slow. These lessons are brief, free of overly complicated grammar jargon, and should be accessible for all learners. So, what do you need to do these Style Pile notes? If you're in my class, ask for a copy, or if you're not in my class, print a copy of the Style Pile notes. Here's how it works. Watch the lessons while filling in your notes. You only need the parts that are in red font. If you want to take down more notes than what's in the red font, you're free to do so. Okay, today's Style Pile notes are going to focus on using analogies. In your first box, the what is it box, I want you to put using analogies. Okay, now to the second box, the rules and examples box. We've got a few rules and examples here. Rule number 1, you must compare two things that seem unrelated but have an interesting similarity. That's what makes an analogy good. You're comparing things that don't seem like they're related, but you kind of make a clever comparison. That's what a good analogy does. All right, rule number 2, usually uses a simile. That's where you compare things with like, as, than, or a metaphor. That's where you just directly compare something. To compare the two things, not always, but almost always, you're using a simile or a metaphor. Rule number 3, if the connection in your analogy is not clear, you must explain it to your audience. So sometimes when you make an analogy, the connection between the two things you're comparing is really clear. You don't have to explain it. But sometimes if it's kind of murky, you do need to explain it to your audience. And let's look at the example below because I think that's going to show you pretty clearly what I mean. As smoking is to the lungs, so is resentment to the soul. Even one puff is bad for you. And there's the person who gave us that quote, right? Let's check our 3 rules. So rule number 1, right? You must compare two things that seem unrelated but have an interesting similarity. Well, we're comparing smoking and its effect on the lungs to resentment and its effect on the soul. Well, to me, that similarity doesn't jump out right away. It follows rule number 1. Cool, we're comparing two things that have an interesting similarity. But as an audience member, I'm going to need the writer or the speaker to break down the similarity there, okay? Let's go on to rule number 2. Usually uses a simile or a metaphor. Smoking is to the lungs, so is resentment is to the soul. That's kind of a metaphor there. It's equating the two of those things. So rule number 2, we'll draw that on here. Boop. Check. All right, and rule number 3, and this is what I was kind of talking about a moment ago. If you only saw the first part that says, as smoking is to the lungs, so is resentment to the soul, I mean, I guess you could kind of figure out the analogy because most of us know smoking's bad for the lungs. Okay, so resentment's bad for the soul. But to really drive it home, she follows rule number 3 here. She makes the connection clear to her audience by explaining it to them. Even one puff is bad for you. Kind of clears up any murkiness that might have been had over that analogy. Again, I think most of us probably could have figured it out, but it's still a good example to show you what a good analogy should look like and how to explain one if you feel like it's not clear. If you need more time to copy down the rules and examples, pause the video. Otherwise, we're heading on to the next slide. Okay, here's another example here for you. It's going to be from Winston Churchill. So I thought it was pretty clever. It says a good speech should be like a woman's skirt, long enough to cover the subject and short enough to create interest. So it does follow our 3 rules here. First of all, we have rule number 1, right? It needs to compare two things that seem unrelated but have a clever connection between them. He's comparing a good speech to a woman's skirt. I bet without the second part, if he just said a good speech should be like a woman's skirt, you'd wonder what the connection was, but he does a good job of explaining it. There is a pretty good connection that he makes. It's kind of clever, right? Rule number 2. It usually uses a simile or a metaphor. A good speech should be like, so it's comparing two things using like, that's a simile, a woman's skirt. Check, check. Now number 3. If the connection or the similarity isn't really clear to your audience, you should explain. I would bet if Winston Churchill just said a good speech should be like a woman's skirt, no one would have any idea what he's talking about. But he goes on to explain it at the end, long enough to cover the subject and short enough to create interest. Ha ha ha, he's trying to make us laugh there by being clever. So it follows rule number 3 though, because if you didn't understand how a good speech should be like a woman's skirt, he explains the analogy at the end. Therefore, it follows all 3 examples. It's a good use of analogy. All right, I want you to pause the video for a moment, and I want you to think to yourself, based on our 3 rules, what is wrong with this example? Okay, hopefully you took a moment to pause the video and try to figure out what is wrong with this example. Let's just kind of read it and go through our 3 rules. Starting college is like getting a bad haircut. So rule number 1, you have to compare 2 things that seem unrelated but have an interesting similarity between them. Well, starting college and getting a bad haircut, they seem unrelated. As far as the similarity, that's not 100% clear right now. So it kind of follows rule number 1, we'll give it, but really the similarity isn't clear. Let's go on to rule number 2 though. Rule number 2, you use a simile or a metaphor. We're comparing college to getting a bad haircut, or starting college to getting a bad haircut. We're using like to compare those 2 things. So rule number 2, we're using a simile. Rule number 3, if the connection isn't clear, you have to explain it to the audience. I'm betting if I asked you right now, well, how is starting college and getting a bad haircut similar? You might be able to come up with something off the top of your head, but in reality, this is not a good analogy. It breaks rule number 3 because that connection between starting college and getting a bad haircut is not really that clear to your audience. It's kind of murky. So this is not a good example of analogy because it's missing rule number 3. All right, I want you to pause the video for a moment. I'm taking that same example, but I want you to think, did I fix the problem here? Based on our 3 rules, did I fix the problem? All right, let's take a look. Starting college is like getting a bad haircut. We know based on our previous slide, that follows rule number 1 and rule number 2. We're comparing starting college to getting a bad haircut. That's 2 unrelated things, it seems like. We're using like, so it's a simile. Now let's check rule number 3. Since the connection wasn't clear, does it explain it to the audience? You feel like you look dumb at first, but as you get used to it, you start to feel cool again. Well, starting college, you might feel like, oh man, I feel too dumb to be here. But then as you get used to it, you start to feel cool again. You start to feel more like yourself. Same with getting a bad haircut. I'm sure everyone has gotten a bad haircut before. You feel kind of dumb at first, but then as time goes on, you get used to it. Or if you don't get used to it, it grows back. And hey, you're not feeling dumb anymore because your hair's come back. So it follows all 3 of our rules. Rule number 1, number 2, number 3. Therefore, it is a good use of an analogy. All right, we're on to our 3rd box now, the use it box. I want you to use an analogy to compare eating the food you hate the most to something else. So think of whatever food you hate the most: ice cream, cake, candy. No, of course not, right? Like broccoli, peas, poi. I don't know if you've ever eaten poi, but oh man, that stuff is gross, okay? And compare it to something else. Make sure your comparison seems like you're comparing 2 unrelated things, but there should be an interesting connection between them. Make sure you follow all 3 rules. Pause the video for a moment and create your analogy. If you're struggling with this, let's take a look at my example. Like being forced to lick an old sock, eating Alfredo leaves a horrible taste in your mouth. So, that's absolutely true, by the way. Alfredo is disgusting, and if anyone thinks otherwise, they're wrong. Because I'm the teacher, so I should know, right? So anyways, rule number 1, right? You have to compare 2 things that seem unrelated but have an interesting connection. I'm comparing licking an old sock to eating Alfredo. Well, those things definitely seem unrelated, right? So rule number 1, we're good with. Rule number 2 usually has a simile or a metaphor. I have like at the start. It's kind of an interesting way to use simile because I'm using it at the start. So I'm using like, therefore I'm following rule number 2 because I'm comparing licking a sock is like eating Alfredo. Bam. Rule number 2. Rule number 3. If the audience is not clear to your if the audience isn't clear to your audience, if the analogy is not clear to your audience, if the similarity is not, you have to explain it. I think with rule number 3 though, mine's pretty clear, okay? Even if you've never licked an old sock, which of course I haven't, right? But even if you've never licked an old sock, I think you can make the connection pretty obviously that, well, licking an old sock sounds gross, therefore this person thinks eating Alfredo is gross too. It follows all three rules, therefore it used an analogy effectively. Check your own example, make sure you've got all three rules followed. If you're not sure, check with your teacher, have them check your analogy. Here are some more examples. I've taken them from various sources. First one is from J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter. It's a pretty funny example if you like Harry Potter especially. Second one is from a famous philosopher, Leo Tolstoy. Again, pretty clever there. Okay, your job now. Add analogies to your writing to add style and flair to your writing. However, using too many analogies in your writing is like putting too much frosting on a cake, which if we look up here, let's take a look at this guy right here, right? Way too much frosting on this cake, man. Look at this. I mean, I like frosting, but geez, right? So using too many analogies is like putting too much frosting on a cake. Too much of a good thing spoils the end product. I don't know about you. I mean, I'd still probably eat this cake because I really like cake and frosting, but I'm betting the majority of us, if we had a choice, would probably choose a cake that didn't have so much frosting piled on top. Same thing for overusing analogies. Thank you for using these style pile notes. If you have any questions about using analogies, don't hesitate to ask your teacher.